Good to see you. Good to hear from you. Hope you enjoy this conversation. We love having conversations, and it's great to have a partner here in the studio. And my partner today is Molly Bidwell. And Molly, I was thinking you and I probably would both like to sit on a porch.
Yes.
And both like to sit and talk, and would enjoy the warm weather. But today is not a good day to be outside.
No, at all.
Tell us about weather in Lincoln.
Well,
and in Jerusalem.
Actually, I live in Jerusalem, and although the weather is similar, because I'm at the end of a long valley, we get this wind that comes up the valley. You could hear it come like a train. It builds and it builds and it builds and it builds, and then it hits us, and then it tears down our trees, and then we're all set.
Tears down your trees?
Well, no, it does some pruning on our trees,
Okay.
let's put it that way.
All right.
We have about 2 feet of snow right now, and although it's warmer today, yesterday it was -18 when I went out to walk the dog in the morning, so it's a little fierce up there.
Well, I guess I'm glad you could come and sit on this little porch and we could talk.
It's warm.
Yeah, I was thinking about the things that you and I have connected with.
Yes.
And I think one that comes to my mind right away is music.
Right.
You are a musician.
I am a musician.
And tell us about that.
I am a viola player. Right now, primarily, I actually started out on piano when I was about 6. But I moved very quickly to a stringed instrument because the piano sat in a room right next to the kitchen, and every time when I was practicing and made a wrong note, my mother would say, "No, do it again." And I couldn't stand that, so I took up the violin because my bedroom was on the 3rd floor, and I could practice up there, and she couldn't hear me. And so I ended up playing stringed instruments, although I kept the piano up as well.
What a great story. we do talk a lot about stories.
Right.
Can you tell some other music stories in your life?
Well, I'm trying to think. Music just sort of came all the way through my life in different kinds of ways. I loved playing. I went to a music camp, actually in Vermont, when I was a young person. And it was a wonderful experience because it was orchestra in the morning, chamber music in the afternoon, and singing at night.
Oh my.
And
it's a full day.
It was a full day, and there were maybe 30 other kids and a bunch of excellent musicians who were teaching us. But we also did things like read the Eliot's 4 quartets at night after we were done singing, or something like that. It was a very great experience for me. Later on, I worked in Summerstock, Gilbert and Sullivan. Are you a Gilbert and Sullivan fan?
Yes.
Aha.
I don't know a great deal by heart, but I enjoy the music a lot.
Lots of people know all these long arios by heart, which is always amusing to me. I worked when I was actually in high school, and that, I suppose, is a story in itself. All the rest of the cast and crew were at least college students, if not professionals or semi-professionals. But they needed an extra violinist, and so I auditioned and got the job sitting in the pit playing the orchestra. And it was a repertory company, so every week we would be rehearsing one show and playing the one that we'd rehearsed the week before. So every week we played a different musical. It was mostly Gilbert and Sullivan, but we also did some light opera, like Fledermaus and Merry Wives of Windsor and things like that.
That's really a great training experience, right?
It was a wonderful training experience. Not everybody gets to do that because playing with voices is much more is very tricky. When you're playing with a pianist, for example, or as a full orchestra, you do have to pay attention to what everybody else is doing. But singers are a special breed. And
did people come from mainly Vermont or from all around to come to this music camp?
in the music camp, it was from all around. There were people from California, young people from California and stuff like that. It's much bigger now than it was when I went there.
It's still in existence?
Yes, it's still in existence. Oh, I've got a good story for you about
Okay,
that.
yeah, please do.
One summer, when I was a student at this music camp, and this would be in the 50s, it was a time of the communist, when people were not getting jobs because they were being told that they were communists. And Pete Seeger was one of those people. There was a couple who ran the camp, and Mrs. Dushkin had done a lot of research in Appalachia, collecting folk songs and stuff like that. Pete Seeger could not get any jobs that summer because he was blacklisted. And so he came to the camp, and for about 2 weeks, he hung around with us, taught us all his repertory, learned a whole bunch of new things from Mrs. Dushkin, and it was just the most incredible experience to have such a charismatic person there.
That must have been great.
It was really fun.
Yeah. So the camp is, we can name the camp.
Oh, the camp is Kinhaven. It's in Weston.
Okay, in Weston.
Yes,
okay.
And it has actually now...
Is that up on the hill as you're going out of Weston?
Well, actually, the priory is up on the hill. The
Right.
camp is just below, down.
Oh, yes.
Down
I
from
know,
the hill.
I know where that is. Yeah,
Okay.
that's great.
Yeah.
And so, but then the other experience was in high school, when you were in high school, right?
When I was in high school, that was on Cape Cod.
Cape Cod.
Yeah, and it
Okay.
was the Oberlin College Light Opera Company.
Are they still?
They're still going. Oberlin College has withdrawn its support of the whole thing, but the show is still going on every summer with college kids primarily, doing basically the same sort of thing. Many more Broadway productions as opposed to all the Gilbert and Sullivan. But I certainly increased my vocabulary as a high school kid.
I would guess.
Doing Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yeah. And so, have you continued to play with the group, or do you play by your solo work?
I continue to play with a group, groups.
Groups.
Northern Vermont is amazing in that it has 3, 4, maybe 5 amateur or semi-amateur orchestras going on. There's one in Burlington, there's one in Barrie, there's one in Montpelier, there's one in Vergennes, and there's another one in Burlington. So if you want an orchestral experience, there's some place that you can usually find it. Of course, they're always looking for strings. Most orchestra things only require like 2 flutes or 2 clarinets,
Right.
and so if you have 15 clarinets, you have to have several more orchestras.
Right. So, favorite group?
Favorite group? Oh, that's hard.
That's hard.
That's hard. I don't think I could
No,
pick
probably,
one.
Probably not
Yeah.
choose one over the
Right.
other.
And then I do a lot of chamber music, trios and quartets and quintets and things like that.
The same group or with different?
Different groups of people.
Well, how does that work? I mean,
Well, you sort of find out this person just moved into town who's a really good pianist, and she loves to play chamber music. And so you invite her to come and play with your sort of little group.
Okay.
And if she passes, it's not an audition, but
it's
a sort of a test to see how they play, and then from there things go on.
Yeah. So there's a lot of this approach to music, right?
Right, right.
And I know there's something, I know a little bit about jazz groups,
Yeah.
but it confirms that there's music every place in
Oh,
Vermont.
absolutely, absolutely. And I've sort of specialized in the more classical realm,
Mm-hmm.
but there are lots of different kinds of opportunities and options.
Yeah.
It's
The other thing you and I know that we share is that we both have gone to seminary.
That's correct.
And can you
That's
tell us
good.
a little bit about that experience for you?
Oh my gosh.
You can tell us quite a bit about that experience for you.
When I went to seminary, I'm an Episcopalian. When I went to seminary, women were not allowed to be ordained.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say that I was a raging feminist and wanted to be ordained, but I went to my bishop, as one has to in the Episcopal Church, and asked if he thought I could go to seminary, and he said, well, you'll have to go through everything that the men go through. And that was sort of amusing in and of itself, because there were things like medical forms where you had to check your prostate and
Okay.
things like that everybody sort of didn't know quite what to do with this woman who was going through all these testing. But I was allowed to go to seminary, and here's an interesting story. In the Episcopal Church, for some time, there were a group of women called deaconesses. They were sort of like nuns, but not quite, because they could often have been married but were now widowed. But they devoted themselves to the church, and they were very instrumental, for example, in setting up tuberculosis hospitals in some of the bigger cities, and also in bringing education to places like Appalachia. But in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, they got kind of disappointed with the church and thought, really, we should be deacons and priests, not deaconesses. And so they had a school in New York where they trained as deaconesses, and they closed that down and sold the building, and with the money they supported my education in seminary as well as a whole bunch of other people's education.
Is that right?
So I went to seminary tuition free thanks to the deaconesses.
The deaconess, there was a deaconess movement in Methodism too.
Oh, was there?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And pretty much did the same kinds of things you were talking about. Friend of mine lives in a deaconess home right now.
Oh, yeah.
Over near Boston.
Oh, awesome.
And when we did have some, because of the lay pastor approach, which went back to John Wesley, lay speakers, lay leaders.
Sure.
That became an entrance point for women earlier.
Of course.
But not in terms of ordination.
Right.
The Episcopalians and the Methodists were doing, I think, that about the same time.
About the same time, that's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of
So when I went to seminary, it wasn't possible to be ordained at all. And there were 3 women in my class and 40 guys. And it was a different kind of education than I was used to, since I'd gone to high school and college in women's colleges. And so all of a sudden to be one of 3 women and all these men, it was very interesting.
Were the male attitudes any better
No,
then?
no,
No?
no. Should you be surprised? Of course not.
No.
No, I mean, they were very gracious for the most part, but they would always sort of say, well, you're only here to marry one of us. So it's just a matter of which one you're going to choose.
Oh, they weren't trying to figure that out.
No. At the second year I was in seminary, the Jesuits, the Roman Catholics, came and shared our seminary building and library and moved from a very cloistered environment in western Massachusetts to a much less cloistered environment with these women. That was interesting because the Jesuits at that point, many of them had come up through the whole Jesuit system and had not been home to see their families for sometimes 10 or 12 years. Some of the Jesuits, or most of them maybe even at that point, had to get their master's at least, or PhD in some field other than theology, and then they would study theology. So they're super bright guys. But they went home for the first time for Christmas, the year that they moved into Cambridge. And we all, our three women, we all had to go shopping with them to buy Christmas presents for their parents and their kids. They had no idea how to go do anything like that. It was really fascinating.
That's exciting to be in a movement at the beginning.
It is, totally.
In a small way or in a big way.
It was hard on the Jesuit faculty because they'd always lectured in Latin, and if they started to translate exactly their lectures into English, they were very embarrassed, and so everybody had to rewrite all their lectures.
So has it changed for you? Your involvement with ordination? Did you go on to serve churches, or?
I was the first woman ordained in the Diocese of New Hampshire, and at that time I was working in a prep school teaching religion and philosophy. And actually that sort of became, rather than going into a congregational situation, I stayed in an educational situation. So I taught in various schools, religion, philosophy, and sometimes music. And we had church services every day in some cases.
So are there quite a few schools still like that available, or is that?
Well, school chaplaincies in the high school level, I don't really know. I think there are actually quite a few, especially connected to the Episcopal Church. And one of the places I taught was Phillips Exeter, and they're not an Episcopal school, but they had a religion requirement.
So what else have you done over these years? Music and going to seminary and.
I went to seminary, got married, I had kids, served a church in Vienna, Austria, for 5 years.
Tell us about that.
Actually, my husband was who was appointed the minister, because, needless to say, an ordained woman in Europe was very difficult. The Vienna Community Church was established. Vienna, at the end of the Second World War, was like Berlin. It was divided into sectors, and the American sector had a chaplaincy there, and there was a whole group of Americans who'd married Austrians who went to that chaplaincy group, but that closed down. But they wanted to have a church that was English speaking, but interdenominational, as it were. And so they established this church, which met in a wonderful building. Franz Joseph II, you know about Franz Joseph II? He was a very liberal emperor, and think Mozart. He allowed 3 churches, as it were, to be not Roman Catholic. There was one that was Lutheran, one that was Reformierte, which is like Presbyterian, and the synagogue. They couldn't look like churches because otherwise people would walk into them and might be corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to look like apartment buildings outside, but inside you walked in and it looked like a synagogue or a church. And so the church that we worshipped in was one of these three churches, the Reformierte Kirche, which is right down in the center of Vienna, close to the riding school. The congregation was about 200, 250 strong, with a 70% turnover every year because people were coming from most international organizations. This was during when it was still the part of the wall was up, and there was a Cold War and everything. You knew not to ever ask anybody what they did, what their job was, because they might have to lie because they were probably a spy, industrial or governmental. But it was also huge music. So on a particular Sunday, you could sort of say, well, let's do a Bach cantata. And somebody who sang in the Volksoper could say, oh, I'll do a solo. And somebody who sang in the Staatsoper would say, oh, I'll do a solo. We could have a little orchestra. And
sounds great.
It was really fun.
Yeah.
It was, about 30 different denominations from all over the world. At that point, I don't know whether Austria still does this or not. Austria gave free education to anybody who could pass the language exam. And so there were lots of Africans who came and became medical doctors. So it was really fun.
So throughout the thread of your life,
Yes.
you've had music and you've had the experience of seminary. How has that impacted your participation, your engagement in community life? What difference did that make for you?
It's what the music
and
the
seminary, and put those two together,
well,
if you can. I'm sure you can.
I mean, I think they're not separate in any kind of way. Music to me is an expression of how we live under God, and so it's difficult to explain. But it's you know, when you're playing a great piece of music, you can feel the Holy Spirit floating around.
I agree with that.
And you don't have to talk about it, but it's there.
My music is, I was a French horn player and played in every band and marched in every parade.
Right.
But all of it pretty much went away. But my wife, of course, has stayed with music, particularly the organ, all these years.
Right.
And I know exactly what you mean when that moment comes, and it's just incredible.
It is. It is. It's remarkable.
And the same thing is true when the moments come, and you know, through the pursuit of ministry for individuals, when all of a sudden, you know, you're in the presence of something remarkable.
Right.
And and really kind of unbelievable.
Right.
But then you also have all those times when there's
you just slog along.
When there's drudgery and disappointment and all that stuff.
Right.
Well, all of which is
right.
You know, so what when you put all that together, what are your reflections upon life? What really comes to you as something really that runs through your life all the time?
Gosh, I don't know. Because I'm sort of more into music, it's almost averbal. It's not I mean, and that's contrary to your whole thing about telling stories, but
No.
but it. When I was driving down here, I was listening to a podcast about arias and opera. It was talking about the aria from the Queen of the Night of Mozart. And I don't know whether you remember that there was a golden record made that was sent out into space
Yes.
to contact aliens and stuff like
Right.
that, and maybe they'd understand us. Well, the aria on that record is the Queen of the Night from Mozart. And, you know, what makes us human is perhaps that aria.
Yeah, that's great. I know when I listen to my wife play, she loves Brahms and Bach and of course, and also some contemporary folks. A good friend of ours is a jazz musician, church musician, and she's introduced that to her congregation.
Great.
And there's a real response to that, and there's a real response when you play the old songs.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and there's such a richness to life that combines the new and the old, I was saying to my wife the other day that I remember the first line of my philosophy professor's lecture when I was in my introduction to philosophy.
Yes.
And it was, philosophy is the willingness to ask the next question.
That's excellent.
And Anne said, and you really tried to do that.
Yeah.
And I thought,
yes.
I thought, okay, great affirmation.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, so are there other things we should talk about
I don't know.
that kicks up here? Since we're doing this is unpracticed, folks.
Very unpracticed.
Very unpracticed, and that's the way we want to keep it that way.
Yeah. I don't know. I was trying to think of other stories. When I lived in Vienna, I did work with a suicide prevention line, and would also do some talks every once in a while. And occasionally I would wander around the city. We didn't have a car, in my clerical collar. And it was just so interesting to me how many women especially would come up to me and say, "Are you a pastor? You know, why are you wearing this collar?" And the Viennese are not, at least then, they were not very demonstrative, but they would come and give me this big hug. Like, you know, not me person, but me as an image of something that might be possible for them later on.
Right. Oh,
which was really fun.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. This has been a lot of fun.
It has.
We'll think of other things as we go into the parking lot.
I know.
But the nice thing is we know where we work together, and we know where we belong, and we'll be able to carry on other conversations. And the good thing about that is also we can enter into conversations with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And just fascinating to see what comes that wasn't prepared and that wasn't expected, and that's really one of the great blessings of life.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing this time.
My pleasure.
It's been nice being with you, and hope you continue in your conversations and your stories in life.